take a deep breath, and let's begin. There are nights when a house seems to remember more than the people inside it. Long after the final visitor has stepped beyond its gates, and the echoes of conversation have faded into the trees, the rooms settle into a silence that feels almost alive. Inside Graceland, polished floors reflect only the soft glow of distant lamps. A piano waits patiently beneath framed photographs, its keys untouched for the moment, as though music itself has decided to rest before returning with the morning. Yet even in such stillness, it is easy to imagine that this place has never truly forgotten the footsteps of the man who once wandered these halls long after midnight. Most people remember Elvis Presley beneath dazzling lights, wrapped in embroidered jumpsuits surrounded by applause so loud it seemed capable of shaking entire arenas. The world knew his smile, his voice, and the extraordinary energy that transformed ordinary stages into unforgettable moments. But applause is a curious companion. It fills every available space while it lasts, only to leave behind a silence that feels larger than the sound itself. Perhaps that is why these quiet rooms invite a different kind of attention, not to uncover secrets, but simply to notice what remains after the music has drifted away. Tonight, there is no audience waiting beyond velvet curtains, no orchestra tuning its instruments, no cameras searching for the perfect angle. Instead, there are only long corridors, carefully chosen furniture, and windows reflecting the moonlight over the gardens outside. It is here, away from the excitement that defined so much of his public life, that another rhythm begins to emerge, slower, softer, almost hidden beneath the familiar story everyone believes they already know. If you listen carefully, not with your ears, but with the quiet part of your imagination, you may discover that every famous life contains two histories. One belongs to the headlines and the records that continue spinning through generations. The other unfolds in empty rooms, during ordinary evenings, in moments too small for newspapers to notice. The second history is often quieter, but no less real. It is this gentle path we will follow tonight. So allow the day to fall away behind you. Let the world become just a little softer around the edges. There is nowhere to hurry now. Together we will move slowly through the life of Elvis Presley, not racing toward milestones already written in history books, but walking instead through the spaces between them, where memory, music, and silence often shared the same room. Graceland itself seems designed for lingering. Purchased in 1957, when Elvis was only 22 years old, the estate quickly became far more than an impressive residence. It offered something increasingly difficult to find as fame expanded across continents, a place where familiar routines could still exist. Friends gathered here, family remained close. Laughter echoed through its rooms, sometimes deep into the night, while outside the gates, admirers continued to wait, hoping for even the briefest glimpse of the man whose records had transformed popular music. During daylight hours, the mansion often carried an unmistakable energy. Staff moved quietly through polished hallways. Visitors arrived with business to discuss. Musicians came and went. Deliveries appeared at the entrance. Telephones rang. Cars rolled along the driveway beneath rows of old trees. The house breathed with activity. Yet after midnight, another personality emerged. Lamps replaced sunlight. Shadows stretched gently across walls decorated with treasured memories. The pace slowed enough that even the smallest sounds, a distant clock, a closing door, the rustle of leaves outside, became part of the evening's quiet composition. It is tempting to imagine famous homes as permanent stages, where every moment carries dramatic importance. In reality, even extraordinary lives contain ordinary hours. A chair is pulled closer to a window. A record is placed onto a turntable. Someone pours another cup of coffee. Pages of a book remain half read beside a favourite armchair. These simple actions rarely become part of history, yet they shape the texture of a person's life just as surely as celebrated performances do. Elvis often preferred the night. Friends and associates would later recall that his schedule frequently drifted beyond conventional hours. While much of the city slept, activity inside Graceland sometimes continued. Conversation stretched comfortably into the early morning. Music played at unexpected times. Television flickered in quiet rooms. The darkness outside seemed less like an ending and more like permission to breathe without quite so many expectations pressing against the day. Perhaps the night offered something that daylight could not. During the day, the world always seemed to want something: another performance, another photograph, another interview, another appearance before thousands of waiting faces. Fame, after all, is rarely content to remain still. It constantly asks for one more smile, one more song, one more unforgettable moment. But midnight asks for very little. It simply arrives, bringing with it enough silence for ordinary thoughts to become audible again. As we walk slowly through these imagined corridors, it helps to remember just how unusual Elvis's journey had become by the time Graceland entered his life. Only a few years earlier, he had been a young man from Mississippi carrying dreams that seemed no larger than those of countless others. There had been no certainty that the records he loved would lead him toward worldwide recognition. No map existed for the path ahead because almost no one had travelled it before in quite the same way. The walls of Graceland eventually held reminders of remarkable accomplishments. Gold records reflected soft light. Gifts from admirers arrived from distant countries. Photographs captured moments shared with presidents, musicians, actors, and lifelong friends. Yet objects have a curious habit. Once the excitement surrounding them fades, they become remarkably quiet. A framed award does not celebrate itself. A trophy remains perfectly still until someone pauses long enough to notice it again. Imagine standing alone in one of those rooms late at night. The shelves remain exactly as they were arranged. The furniture waits patiently beneath carefully chosen lamps. Outside, the trees move gently whenever a breeze passes through Memphis. Everything appears calm, yet each object quietly carries echoes of countless journeys. Concert halls filled with voices, recording studios alive with creativity, highways travelled under changing skies, hotel rooms visited only briefly before another city called. Memory often behaves much like music. Certain places become connected to particular emotions so completely that entering the room seems enough to hear melodies that no one is actually playing. Perhaps that explains why Graceland continues to feel deeply connected to Elvis even in silence. The songs are absent, yet somehow never entirely gone. Before audiences numbered in the thousands, before international tours, before Hollywood cameras followed his every movement, there was simply a young man fascinated by sound. Gospel harmonies, country melodies, blues rhythms, all found their way into his imagination long before they reached enormous audiences. Those influences would eventually reshape modern music, but in the beginning they existed only as voices carried through churches, neighborhood gatherings, radio broadcasts, and records played over and over until every note became familiar. Even as success expanded beyond anything he might reasonably have imagined, music itself remained surprisingly simple. It always began the same way. Someone sang, someone listened. A melody found another heart willing to carry it forward. Fame complicated nearly everything surrounding that process, but it never altered the essential mystery of why certain voices seemed capable of reaching people across generations. There is something comforting about remembering that the world's most recognizable performers also spent countless quiet hours simply listening. Before creating unforgettable songs, they first became attentive audiences themselves. Elvis admired many artists throughout his life. He absorbed different musical traditions with genuine curiosity, allowing influences to blend naturally rather than forcing them together. The confidence audiences witnessed later on stage rested upon years of careful observation that often unfolded far from public attention. Perhaps this is why empty music rooms possess such unusual emotional weight. Instruments waiting in silence seem less abandoned than patient. They remind us that every celebrated performance begins in stillness before the first note appears. Even after the final applause has disappeared, the instruments remain exactly where they were, ready whenever inspiration returns. Some evenings at Graceland, friends gathered around the piano simply because someone felt like singing. There was no audience to impress, no tickets to sell, No newspaper reviews arriving the following morning. Familiar songs drifted through familiar rooms among people who had known one another long enough to forget, if only briefly, the extraordinary life unfolding beyond the front gates. Those moments rarely appeared in headlines, yet they reveal something quietly important. Music was not only a profession, it was also companionship. Outside, admirers continued leaving flowers, letters, and messages expressing gratitude. Many would never meet Elvis personally, yet they felt connected through songs that had accompanied first dances, long drives, family celebrations, lonely evenings, and hopeful beginnings. Music possesses that remarkable ability. A recording made in one room can become part of countless lives elsewhere, travelling farther than its creator could ever follow. Inside the mansion, however, the relationship with music remained much more immediate. A familiar melody could awaken childhood memories. A gospel hymn might recall quiet Sunday mornings from years long past. A favourite record might invite conversations that wandered naturally from laughter into thoughtful silence. Songs did not merely entertain, they carried pieces of time itself. As midnight deepened, Graceland often seemed suspended between two worlds. Beyond its gates stretched the enormous public story known around the globe. Within its rooms existed something gentler, daily habits, familiar voices, comfortable routines, and ordinary moments that rarely attracted attention precisely because they were ordinary. Yet perhaps those unnoticed moments mattered most. They offered balance against the relentless pace of celebrity, reminding everyone inside that life was still composed of evenings, meals, conversations, and quiet reflection. It is easy, looking backward through history, to see only milestones. The first hit record, the unforgettable television appearances, the sold-out concerts, the cultural influence that continues decades later. But lives are never experienced as collections of highlights. They unfold hour by hour, often so gradually that no single day seems destined for history until many years have passed. Tonight, we are resisting that temptation to hurry. There will be time for the concerts, the films, the remarkable rise that reshaped entertainment around the world. Those chapters are waiting patiently ahead. For now, it is enough simply to remain here a little longer, where moonlight rests quietly across the grounds of Graceland, and the house itself seems content to breathe in silence, remembering without speaking. Perhaps every great story deserves to begin this way, not with applause, but with stillness. Not with certainty, but with gentle curiosity. Before the stages, before the headlines, before millions learned his name, there was simply a young man whose life would gradually become larger than almost anyone could have imagined. And somewhere within the quiet that surrounds this place tonight, that beginning still feels surprisingly close. Long before Graceland became a place of pilgrimage, before bright stage lights reflected from jewelled costumes, and before newspapers around the world learned to print his name in enormous headlines, there was another home entirely. It was smaller, quieter, and shaped by ordinary days rather than extraordinary expectations. If we leave the silent halls of Memphis behind for a while, and travel gently backward through time, we arrive in a different landscape altogether, one of narrow roads, modest neighborhoods, and the warm southern air of northeastern Mississippi. In the early morning, the town of Tupelo woke slowly. Storefront windows caught the first light of the sun, church bells occasionally drifted across the streets, and families began another day much like the one before it. There was little to suggest that this quiet place would one day become forever connected with one of the most recognizable voices in modern music. Towns rarely know the futures they are quietly preparing. On January 8th, 1935, Elvis Presley was born here to Gladys Presley and Vernon Presley. He entered the world as the surviving twin, his brother, Jesse Garon Presley, having been stillborn. It is a fact often mentioned in biographies because it belongs to the historical record, yet it was not something discussed publicly throughout his childhood. Like many deeply personal family experiences, it simply became part of the quiet foundation upon which the rest of life would gradually be built. Their home reflected neither wealth nor luxury. It was a modest 2-room house built with the help of family members and friends. The rooms were simple. Furniture served practical purposes rather than decorative ones. Every object earned its place through usefulness. Yet simplicity often creates its own kind of closeness. There were few spaces large enough for people to disappear into separate worlds. Life unfolded together. Imagine an evening settling over that little house. A single lamp glows softly against wooden walls. Outside, insects sing beneath the Mississippi sky, while distant voices fade as neighbors return indoors. The day has been long. Supper has ended. Someone straightens a chair. Another closes the window just enough to keep the night air comfortable. No one is thinking about sold-out arenas or international tours. The future remains wonderfully ordinary, because no one can yet see how extraordinary it will become. The family experienced financial hardship more than once. There were periods when money remained scarce, and ordinary necessities demanded careful planning. Such circumstances were not unusual during those years in many parts of the American South. Countless families measured success not through luxury but through stability, gratitude, and the hope that tomorrow might be just a little easier than today. Children growing up in modest surroundings often develop an unusual awareness of small comforts. A warm meal carries greater meaning. A new pair of shoes feels memorable. A familiar song heard after a difficult week becomes something worth carrying in the heart. Perhaps this sensitivity to ordinary joys quietly shaped the young Elvis long before audiences ever heard him sing. His mother, Gladys, shared an especially close bond with her son. Those who knew the family often remembered the warmth between them. Their connection appeared natural rather than dramatic, expressed through everyday affection instead of grand gestures. In later years, despite worldwide fame, that closeness remained an important part of his life. Success would alter almost everything around him, but some emotional foundations had been laid too early and too deeply to disappear. His father, Vernon, worked hard to provide for the family whenever opportunities arose. Like many parents facing uncertain economic conditions, he accepted different kinds of work, always hoping to create a steadier future. The rhythm of labour, responsibility and perseverance quietly surrounded Elvis throughout childhood. Fame had not yet entered the picture. What existed instead was the familiar determination shared by many families striving to build ordinary lives under challenging circumstances. If we were to stand outside that small house at dusk, we might hear something drifting through an open window. Not polished performances, but voices singing together. Music arrived naturally in daily life. It did not require a stage. It belonged to kitchens, front porches, neighborhood gatherings, and especially churches. Songs carried comfort, celebration, sorrow, and hope all at once. Among the strongest musical influences of his early years was gospel music. Church services offered far more than sermons alone. Congregations sang with sincerity that required no technical perfection. Harmony emerged from shared feeling rather than careful rehearsal. The sound filled wooden sanctuaries with remarkable warmth, rising toward high ceilings before gently settling back over the people below. For a young listener, such experiences could leave lasting impressions. Gospel music possessed emotion, without needing spectacle. Every voice mattered, whether polished or imperfect. The power came from togetherness. Long before Elvis developed the performance style that would captivate millions, he encountered music as something deeply communal, a language spoken by entire rooms rather than individual stars. One can almost picture him sitting quietly during a service, listening more carefully than anyone realized. Adults often underestimate the attention of children. While conversations continue around them, young minds collect details with remarkable patience. A melody repeated week after week becomes familiar. A harmony settles into memory almost without effort. Years later, those sounds may return unexpectedly, shaping artistic choices that seem entirely original, while quietly carrying echoes of childhood. Outside church walls, another musical world waited. Radio stations carried country songs across long distances. Blues musicians performed with raw emotional honesty. Rhythm and melody crossed invisible boundaries between communities, finding listeners wherever curious ears happened to be waiting. The American South was already rich with musical traditions, even if few imagined how profoundly they would soon reshape popular culture. The young Elvis did not separate these influences into neat categories. He simply listened. Gospel, blues, country, and popular recordings all entered the same curious imagination. Instead of choosing one path, he absorbed many. This openness would later become one of his greatest strengths, allowing familiar traditions to meet one another in ways audiences had rarely experienced before. Listening itself is a quiet activity. There is no applause, no celebration. Nothing dramatic appears to happen from the outside. Yet deep listening often changes a person more completely than speaking ever can. Perhaps many remarkable careers begin not with extraordinary talent alone, but with extraordinary attention. School introduced its own routines. Classrooms followed predictable schedules. Teachers explained lessons. Friendships formed gradually. Days unfolded with the comfortable repetition familiar to children everywhere. There were moments of confidence and moments of uncertainty, successes alongside disappointments. History sometimes remembers future icons as though they moved confidently toward destiny from the beginning, but childhood rarely feels that way while it is being lived. In truth, most remarkable lives appear perfectly ordinary while they are unfolding. No invisible narrator announces which afternoons will someday matter. A walk home after school remains just another walk. A song sung quietly in a church remains simply another hymn. A birthday arrives, passes, and becomes memory without revealing what lies decades ahead. One of the most meaningful gifts of his early years came in the form of a guitar. Family stories recall that young Elvis had hoped for a bicycle or perhaps a rifle, common wishes among boys of the time. Instead, he received an inexpensive guitar. At first glance, it may have seemed like a small disappointment. Yet history has an unexpected way of transforming modest moments into turning points visible only in retrospect. The instrument itself was simple. It offered no promise of fame. Countless children owned guitars that never carried them beyond their own front porches. The object mattered less than what followed. Gradually, fingers learned where strings rested beneath them. Chords appeared awkward before becoming familiar. Melodies emerged slowly, one careful note after another. Learning music rarely feels dramatic. It asks for repetition rather than excitement. The same movement is practiced again and again until effort becomes instinct. Quiet evenings spent with an instrument often leave little visible evidence, yet they build invisible foundations strong enough to support extraordinary achievements years later. Imagine another evening in Tupelo. The day's work has ended. Outside, darkness settles across the neighborhood. Inside the house, a young boy experiments carefully with chords, pausing whenever something sounds almost right. There is no audience applauding each improvement, only patient practice, interrupted occasionally by conversation drifting from another room. Great stories often begin with scenes exactly like this, small enough that no one recognizes their significance. As confidence grew, so too did curiosity. Songs heard in church could now be explored independently. Melodies from the radio became invitations rather than distant performances. Music changed from something received into something created. That transition, though gradual, quietly altered the direction of an entire life. Children often imitate before they innovate. They borrow phrases, copy rhythms, and echo voices they admire. This is not a lack of originality, but its earlier stage. Every artist begins by listening to others. Only later does a distinct voice emerge, shaped by countless influences blending together, until imitation gently transforms into individuality. The Mississippi landscape itself became part of those formative years. Dirt roads stretched beneath broad skies. Seasonal changes arrived gently compared with harsher northern climates. Summer evenings lingered long enough for conversations on front porches. Rainstorms rolled across open fields with slow determination. Such surroundings encourage observation. Nature moves at its own pace, indifferent to human ambition. Perhaps this is why memories of childhood often feel quieter than memories of success. They are filled not with achievements but with textures, warm air through an open window, wooden floorboards beneath bare feet, distant train whistles carried across the evening, familiar voices calling from nearby yards. These details rarely appear in official biographies, yet they remain among the strongest companions of memory. Eventually, the Presley family would leave Tupelo and move to Memphis in search of better opportunities. The journey was not unusual for families hoping to improve their circumstances. Cities promised employment, fresh beginnings, and possibilities unavailable in smaller towns. No one could know that this move would also place Elvis within reach of a musical environment unlike any he had previously known. But before Memphis, before recording studios, before the world learned to recognize a distinctive voice, there was this quieter chapter, a childhood shaped by family, modest means, faith, careful listening, and the patient discovery of music. It did not announce greatness, it simply prepared the ground upon which something remarkable could eventually grow. As the night deepens around us, that little house in Tupelo feels farther away than Graceland, and yet perhaps it is closer to the heart of the story. Fame would later surround Elvis with extraordinary things, but the earliest melodies were born in ordinary rooms. The crowds had not yet arrived, the lights had not yet risen. There was only a boy, a guitar, familiar voices, and evenings that seemed no different from countless others. Sometimes the quietest beginnings leave the longest echoes. When the Presley family settled in Memphis, the city did not greet them with fanfare or promise. Like countless newcomers arriving in search of opportunity, they entered a place already alive with its own rhythms. Streetcars rattled along busy roads. Storefronts opened each morning beneath signs weathered by southern summers. Factory whistles marked the passing hours, while churches, cafes, and neighborhood shops quietly stitched together the routines of everyday life. For most families, Memphis was simply a city where one hoped to build something steadier than yesterday. Yet beneath those ordinary routines, another current moved almost invisibly. Music drifted through Memphis in ways difficult to separate from daily life. It floated from open windows during warm evenings, escaped through church doors on Sunday mornings, spilled from neighborhood jukeboxes, and travelled across radio frequencies into homes where listeners gathered without realizing they were witnessing the beginning of something new. The city itself seemed to hum softly, as though every street carried its own melody waiting to be noticed. For a young Elvis Presley, this environment offered something far richer than entertainment. It became a place of listening. There was no urgent plan to become famous, no carefully designed career waiting to unfold. Instead, there existed an endless collection of sounds, each one quietly asking to be remembered. Imagine him walking through a Memphis neighborhood in the fading light of evening. The sidewalks still hold the warmth of the afternoon sun. Somewhere nearby, someone practices piano behind a half-open window. A passing automobile carries the distant sound of a country station playing through its radio. Farther down the street, laughter rises briefly before disappearing again into the ordinary comfort of another family's supper hour. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything seems connected by music. Cities often teach through proximity. In smaller towns, traditions sometimes remain separated by distance. Memphis brought many traditions close enough to touch one another. Gospel choirs, rhythm and blues musicians, country performers, and jazz artists all occupied different corners of the same city. Their audiences occasionally overlapped. Their influences quietly crossed invisible boundaries. New sounds emerged not because anyone planned them, but because people listened with open ears. The young Elvis possessed precisely that kind of curiosity. Friends from those years often remembered him as someone deeply interested in music rather than obsessed with celebrity. He paid attention. Songs were not merely background noise filling empty space. He noticed voices, phrasing, emotion, and timing. Different singers approached the same melody in different ways, and somehow each performance revealed another possibility. There is something wonderfully patient about learning through listening. It asks nothing from the world except time. No applause follows, no certificates are awarded. progress remains almost invisible until one day a familiar song begins to sound different. Not because the melody has changed, but because the listener has. By the early 1950s, Memphis had become home to one of the most influential recording studios in American music history, Sun Studio. From the outside, it appeared surprisingly modest. There were no towering columns announcing greatness, no extravagant architecture designed to impress passers-by. The building sat quietly among the ordinary streets of the city, giving little indication that inside its walls musical history was slowly taking shape. Studios possess a curious atmosphere unlike concert halls. Concert venues anticipate audiences. Recording rooms anticipate silence. Thick walls soften outside noise. Microphones wait patiently beneath the dim lights. Instruments rest where musicians last placed them. Every sound becomes noticeable because every unnecessary sound disappears. Even today, stepping into such a room often feels like entering a place where time itself moves more carefully. Long before Elvis ever stood before a microphone there, countless hours had already been spent simply imagining possibilities. Producers, engineers, and musicians searched for fresh voices, new combinations, and authentic emotion. Technology mattered, certainly, but it served something far older: the timeless desire to preserve a human voice long enough for someone else to hear it later. The owner of Sun Studio, Sam Phillips, believed deeply in discovering original talent. He listened beyond technical perfection, searching instead for sincerity and individuality. Such qualities are difficult to define and impossible to manufacture. One either hears them or does not. Meanwhile, Elvis continued living an ordinary life by outward appearances. He graduated from Humes High School in 1953. Like many young adults, he took work where opportunities appeared, including employment with the Crown Electric Company. His days were practical. Bills still needed paying. Responsibilities continued. Dreams, if they existed, remained largely private. It is comforting to remember that remarkable futures often coexist quietly. Beside ordinary jobs, imagine the rhythm of those days. Morning begins early. Work occupies the daylight hours. The city continues its familiar routines. Evening eventually arrives, bringing enough quiet to return once more to music. A guitar waits nearby. Favourite records spin again. Familiar melodies become companions after long shifts. There is no certainty that these evenings are preparing anything extraordinary. They simply feel necessary. Perhaps that is how true passions reveal themselves, not through dramatic declarations, but through consistent return. We come back to what quietly restores us, even when no one else is watching. One afternoon in the summer of 1953, Elvis entered Sun Studio for a reason both simple and deeply personal. He paid to record a small acetate disc containing songs intended as a gift for his mother. Historians continue discussing exactly how this visit unfolded, yet what remains clear is that the recording introduced his voice to the people working there. Picture that moment slowly. A modest recording room, a microphone standing patiently in the centre. The quiet awareness that someone's voice is about to become permanent. There is something strangely intimate about recording. A live performance disappears into memory the moment it ends. A recording remains. It captures not only notes but breath, hesitation, confidence, uncertainty, and countless tiny details that listeners may never consciously notice. Elvis sang, not before thousands, not beneath dazzling lights, only inside a small room where very few people listened. History often hides itself inside such moments. No headlines appeared the following morning announcing that popular music had changed forever. The city continued as usual. Cars filled the streets. Families prepared evening meals. Businesses opened and closed according to schedule. Somewhere, the small recording simply waited. Time itself sometimes seems to pause before recognizing significance. Months later, Sam Phillips remembered the young singer. There was something distinctive about his voice that resisted easy categorization. It carried familiar influences without sounding like a direct imitation of any single performer. It moved comfortably between styles that audiences often considered separate. Country seemed to meet rhythm and blues naturally rather than awkwardly. This was unusual, not because no one had ever blended influences before, but because Elvis seemed to do so instinctively. He did not appear interested in proving musical theories. He simply sang. There are artists whose originality comes from careful invention. Others discover originality almost accidentally, by remaining honest to everything they genuinely love. Elvis belonged more naturally to the second path. The music that shaped him during childhood refused to remain divided inside his imagination. Gospel harmonies, blues emotion, country storytelling, and popular melodies simply lived together. Eventually came the recording session that music historians would revisit again and again. During one evening at Sun Studio in 1954, Elvis worked alongside guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black. Like many studio sessions, the day progressed without obvious breakthroughs. Songs were attempted, arrangements explored, possibilities considered. Nothing seemed entirely right. Creative work often unfolds this way. Progress hides beneath apparent repetition. Hours pass quietly. People continue trying. Then, sometimes without warning, something changes. During a relaxed moment between formal takes, Elvis began singing "That's All Right" with lively energy. Moore joined naturally on guitar. Black followed on bass. The room shifted almost immediately. Sam Phillips recognized that something unexpected had appeared. One can imagine the atmosphere. No dramatic lightning. No triumphant orchestral swell. Only three musicians discovering a sound together. A producer listening more carefully than before. A studio suddenly becoming very still, because everyone sensed they should not interrupt whatever had just begun. Some moments announced themselves quietly. The recording that followed would become Elvis's first commercial single. Yet even then, no one possessed a complete picture of the future. Success rarely arrives carrying a full explanation. Instead, it comes one opportunity at a time. After local radio stations began playing the recording, listeners responded with enthusiasm. Calls arrived asking who the singer was. Curiosity spread naturally. The voice sounded both familiar and entirely new. It respected existing traditions while refusing to remain confined within them. Imagine a family gathered around their radio during an ordinary evening. The announcer introduces a new record. Music begins. Someone pauses halfway through washing dishes. Another looks up from reading the newspaper. Children stop talking for just a moment. No one yet knows they're hearing the beginning of one of the most influential recording careers in modern history. They simply know that something feels different. It is fascinating how often history first enters homes quietly, not through speeches, not through ceremonies, but through ordinary moments when someone decides not to change the station. As the months unfolded, performances became more frequent. Local audiences responded with increasing excitement. Musicians who shared stages with Elvis noticed the energy surrounding him. His movements, confidence, and natural connection with audiences distinguished him from many performers of the era. Yet beneath that growing confidence remained the attentive listener who had spent years absorbing every musical influence available. Success had begun, but it remained close enough to its origins that ordinary life had not entirely disappeared. There were still drives home after performances, still conversations among friends, still evenings when tomorrow remained uncertain. The future had opened a door, but only slightly. Looking back now, it is tempting to see inevitability in every decision. Yet nothing felt inevitable while it was happening. Careers can stall, opportunities disappear, public attention shifts quickly. The people inside those early recording sessions could not possibly know how far these songs would travel. Perhaps that uncertainty gave the music part of its vitality. There was little reason to perform cautiously. No enormous reputation required protection. Only the simple hope that listeners might respond. As midnight settles gently over our own journey tonight, the lights inside Sun Studio seem to dim once again. The microphones grow quiet. Instruments return to their stands. Outside, Memphis continues breathing beneath the southern sky exactly as it always has. Inside that modest room, however, something almost impossible has begun. Not merely a career, not merely fame, but the quiet emergence of a voice that will soon carry childhood memories, southern traditions, and countless influences far beyond the city where they first came together. The world has not yet fully noticed, but the silence before great change is growing shorter. Morning arrived over Memphis much as it always had. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, delivery trucks rolled through familiar streets, coffee steamed gently from kitchen tables, while newspapers landed on front porches across the city. Somewhere, radios came alive with weather reports, local news, and the songs that accompanied ordinary routines. To most people, it was simply another day beginning without ceremony. Yet for Elvis Presley, life had begun to move at a pace that no longer matched the quiet rhythm of those familiar mornings. Success rarely announces the exact moment when it becomes something larger than itself. At first, it feels almost manageable. One successful performance leads to another invitation. A recording receives more radio play than expected. More people recognize a familiar face in town. Friends begin mentioning that they heard your song somewhere unexpected. Small changes accumulate so gradually that they almost appear harmless. Then one day, the road no longer leads home as often as it once did. By late 1954 and into 1955, Elvis found himself travelling across the American South with increasing frequency. The highways became familiar companions. Long stretches of pavement connected one small town to another, each offering a different audience gathered beneath theatre lights or inside community halls. Some venues were modest enough that the performers could hear individual conversations before stepping onto the stage. Others buzzed with an excitement that hinted at something larger beginning to unfold. Imagine one of those evenings. The sun has nearly disappeared beyond the horizon. A modest theatre glows softly against the gathering darkness. Families arrive together, young couples find their seats, and local musicians quietly prepare backstage. Folding chairs scrape gently across wooden floors. The air carries the faint scent of polished timber mixed with fresh popcorn and perfume. No one yet realizes they are witnessing the early days of a performer who will soon redefine popular culture. Backstage, the atmosphere feels surprisingly calm. A guitar rests against a chair. Someone checks an amplifier. Musicians exchange quiet conversation while waiting for the evening to begin. There is laughter, but it is not forced. There is anticipation, but it has not yet become pressure. These are still the days before enormous expectations settle upon every performance. Travel itself became part of the education. Highways reveal a country differently than airplanes ever can. Driving from town to town allows landscapes to unfold patiently. Cotton fields give way to forests. Small diners appear beside quiet roads. Gas stations become familiar stopping places where strangers share brief conversations before continuing in different directions. The journey becomes as much a part of the experience as the destination. Perhaps those long drives offered moments of reflection that would later become increasingly difficult to find. Inside an automobile, the world narrows gently. The road stretches ahead. Music plays softly through the speakers. Conversation comes and goes naturally. Silence no longer feels empty because movement itself provides company. Many musicians have spoken about the unusual rhythm of touring. Performances may last only an hour or two, but the hours surrounding them are filled with waiting. Waiting to arrive, waiting backstage, waiting for equipment, waiting in hotel rooms after audiences have gone home. The excitement visible to audiences occupies only a small portion of the day. Everything else unfolds quietly behind the scenes. Elvis was learning this rhythm almost without realizing it. The applause was growing louder. The quiet hours were growing longer. Among those helping guide his career was Colonel Tom Parker. Parker recognized possibilities where others often saw only successful regional performances. He possessed an extraordinary instinct for promotion and understood that public attention could be carefully cultivated rather than simply hoped for. His methods would become the subject of much discussion in later decades, but during these early years, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Elvis's career was expanding beyond local success. Opportunities multiplied, concert bookings increased, radio stations requested more recordings. People who had never met one another began speaking the same name in different cities, It is an unusual experience to become known by strangers. Most human relationships develop slowly through conversation and shared experience. Fame reverses that order. Millions feel they know someone whom they have never actually met. For the person at the centre of that attention, the world begins changing in subtle ways long before they fully understand what has happened. Restaurants become different. Walking through city streets becomes different. Shopping becomes different. Ordinary errands quietly disappear. At first, however, those changes still felt incomplete. Elvis could occasionally move through public spaces with relative ease. Recognition was increasing, but it had not yet reached overwhelming levels. There remained precious moments when life retained something close to normality. Those moments would not last forever. As audiences grew larger, another transformation quietly emerged, not merely in the size of the crowds, but in their emotional response. People did not simply enjoy the performances, they experienced them. Young fans screamed with excitement. Others leaned forward as though afraid to miss even the smallest gesture. The atmosphere inside theatres changed the instant Elvis walked onto the stage. Energy travelled through the audience almost visibly, moving from one row to another like ripples spreading across still water. Historians have often tried to explain this phenomenon through sociology, marketing, or changing cultural attitudes. Those explanations certainly contain truth, yet they also risk overlooking something simpler. Sometimes a performer connects with audiences in ways that resist complete explanation. Not every powerful human experience fits neatly into analysis. Imagine standing backstage just before one of those increasingly crowded performances. The curtain remains closed. Beyond it, hundreds of voices blend into a soft roar. Footsteps echo quietly across the wooden floor. Someone adjusts a microphone. Another musician tunes a guitar one final time. There is always one brief moment before walking onto the stage when everything becomes unexpectedly still. The audience waits. The performer waits. Both sides exist together in silence before the first note bridges the distance between them. Perhaps those few seconds remained among the quietest moments of Elvis's professional life. He had not yet begun singing. The audience had not yet begun cheering. For the briefest instant, possibility itself filled the room. Then the music began. Night after night, the performances became more confident. His voice carried remarkable warmth while remaining unmistakably his own. His movements appeared natural rather than rehearsed. He smiled easily. He seemed genuinely delighted by the music itself. Audiences often recognize authenticity long before critics describe it. The songs were important. The recordings mattered. But people also responded to the feeling that the man on stage truly loved performing. Joy has a way of travelling farther than technique alone. As 1955 continued, larger figures within the music industry began paying close attention. Regional popularity had become impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether Elvis possessed talent. The question had become how far that talent might reach. Eventually, one of the most significant opportunities of his early career arrived. RCA Victor acquired Elvis's recording contract from Sun Records in late 1955, an agreement that marked a profound turning point. The transaction reflected growing confidence that his appeal extended far beyond regional audiences. It also meant access to broader distribution, greater promotional resources and national visibility, unlike anything he had previously experienced. For Sam Phillips, the decision carried mixed emotions. He had discovered the young singer whose recordings had begun attracting widespread attention. Letting him go was not simple, yet the agreement also provided financial stability for Sun Records, allowing the studio to continue discovering other remarkable artists. History often advances through decisions that feel both hopeful and bittersweet. One chapter quietly closes, another opens before anyone fully understands its size. Imagine the final evening before such a transition. The recording studio appears unchanged. The same walls, the same microphones, the same instruments waiting patiently. Yet everyone present senses that tomorrow will not resemble yesterday. Places rarely change overnight. Lives often do. National exposure soon followed. Radio stations across America introduced Elvis's recordings to listeners who had never visited Memphis or heard him perform live. Families from distant states encountered the same voice that had first surprised local audiences only months earlier. The songs travelled where the singer could not, crossing mountains, rivers and cities with effortless ease. There is something quietly remarkable about recorded music. A voice captured inside one small room can accompany someone else's evening hundreds, or even thousands of miles away. Perhaps a farmer listened while finishing work at sunset. Perhaps a college student heard the song drifting through a dormitory hallway. Perhaps a young couple danced together in their living room after supper. The singer would never meet most of these listeners, yet the music entered their memories just the same. As popularity expanded, newspaper photographers became increasingly familiar companions. Interviews appeared more frequently. Questions repeated themselves from city to city. How does success feel? Where did your style come from? What comes next? Public curiosity grows quickly. It always wants another answer, another photograph, another glimpse behind the curtain. Yet behind every interview remained ordinary evenings, hotel rooms, quiet meals, letters from home, conversations with friends, moments when fame temporarily stepped outside the room, allowing life to breathe normally again. These quieter hours often disappear from historical memory because they produce few headlines. But human beings cannot exist only within extraordinary moments. Even icons require ordinary time, a walk outside, a familiar conversation, the comfort of hearing someone use your first name without ceremony. As the years ahead approached, those ordinary moments would become increasingly precious. The crowds would grow larger, the schedules busier, the expectations heavier. But for now, the journey still carried something of its original wonder. There remained genuine surprise whenever audiences responded so enthusiastically. There remained gratitude. There remained curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. Tonight, as we slowly leave another chapter behind, the highways of the American South stretch quietly beneath a sky filled with stars. Somewhere a car continues moving toward another performance. A guitar rests safely inside its case. Hotel lights glow softly in distant towns waiting for morning. The young man travelling those roads cannot yet see the full shape of the life unfolding before him. He knows the next destination, perhaps the one after that. But beyond the next horizon waits something larger than even the brightest dreams carried from Tupelo. The applause is no longer confined to a handful of theatres. It is beginning to spread across an entire nation. And with every mile travelled, the quiet spaces between performances become just a little more valuable than before. There comes a point in every extraordinary life when movement becomes so constant that stillness begins to feel unfamiliar. Not because silence has disappeared, but because it has become harder to reach. As Elvis Presley entered 1956, the pace of his life changed once again. The highways that had carried him from one southern town to another gradually gave way to airplanes, larger venues, national broadcasts, and schedules that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. Days no longer belonged entirely to him. They belonged to recording sessions, rehearsals, interviews, photographers, managers, promoters, and audiences waiting in cities he had not yet visited. The world was becoming louder. His own quiet moments were becoming smaller. Imagine an early morning inside a hotel room. Heavy curtains soften the daylight. A suitcase rests unopened near the door because another journey will begin, before long. Yesterday's newspaper lies folded on a small table, carrying photographs from the previous night's performance. The room is neat, almost anonymous. Apart from a guitar leaning quietly against the wall, there is little to suggest who has slept here. Hotels possess a strange quality. They are designed for rest, yet they are rarely places where life truly settles. Every room resembles the last. Every hallway feels vaguely familiar. One city quietly blends into another. For touring musicians, these temporary spaces become part of everyday existence. A room may feel comfortable for a single evening, but by morning it has already become another memory left behind. Elvis adjusted to this rhythm because he had little choice. Schedules arrived before sunrise. Cars waited outside. Reporters gathered in hotel lobbies. Fans sometimes stood patiently near entrances for hours, hoping to wave as he passed. Recognition had grown beyond occasional excitement. Now it followed him almost everywhere. In January 1956, RCA Victor released Heartbreak Hotel. The recording carried an atmosphere unlike many popular songs of its era. It sounded spacious, lonely, almost dreamlike in places. There was confidence in the performance, yet also a quiet melancholy that listeners found difficult to forget. Within weeks, the record climbed rapidly through the charts, becoming one of the defining songs of his early career. Imagine families hearing it for the first time. A record player spins slowly in a living room. Needle meets vinyl. The room fills with a voice that somehow sounds intimate, despite travelling across countless miles. Someone pauses what they are doing, another listens without speaking. The song ends. No one rushes to explain why it feels different. Some music simply asks to be heard again. As sales increased, so did attention. Radio stations played the song repeatedly. Music stores struggled to keep copies in stock. Journalists searched for fresh ways to describe the phenomenon unfolding before them. Words like popular and successful suddenly seemed too small. There was a growing awareness that something larger was taking place. Success often changes gradually before appearing sudden. To the outside world, Elvis seemed to emerge almost overnight. To those who had watched the years of careful listening, modest performances, and patient recording sessions, the journey had been anything but sudden. It had simply reached a point where the world finally noticed. Television soon became another stage. Unlike radio, television invited audiences not only to hear but also to watch. Every smile, every movement, every gesture became part of the performance. Millions of viewers welcomed him into their homes without ever leaving their living rooms. One evening, imagine a family gathered around a black and white television. The picture flickers softly. Children sit close to the screen. Parents watch with equal curiosity. The announcer introduces Elvis Presley. For a few minutes, countless separate households become connected through the same performance. No theatre could have held such an audience. No concert hall could have contained so many expectant faces. The room itself remained quiet. The country listened together. One of the most significant appearances came on Stage Show, where Elvis reached viewers far beyond the audiences who had attended his concerts. More television appearances followed, each expanding his reach. His combination of vocal warmth, confidence, and unmistakable stage presence proved impossible to ignore. Soon afterward came performances on The Milton Berle Show and later The Steve Allen Show. Each broadcast generated conversation. Some viewers celebrated his originality. Others questioned whether such energetic performances belonged on national television. Newspapers debated. Parents discussed him over supper. Teenagers admired him openly. Critics formed opinions with remarkable confidence. Fame often invites disagreement as naturally as admiration. The louder the applause becomes, the more voices begin speaking about the person receiving it. Yet inside dressing rooms before each broadcast, another reality continued. A mirror surrounded by lights, a neatly prepared outfit waiting nearby, musicians quietly reviewing arrangements, someone checking microphones one final time. Outside the door, producers count down the remaining minutes. Inside, there is only breathing, waiting, another beginning. Backstage spaces possess their own silence. Unlike concert halls, they are filled with preparation rather than performance. Voices remain lower, footsteps become more careful. Everyone knows that once the curtain rises, everything will move very quickly. Perhaps these moments before stepping into public view became increasingly precious. They lasted only a minute or two. Yet during that brief pause, the world still waited outside. No cameras, no applause, only the quiet awareness that another unforgettable moment was about to begin. As popularity soared, fans responded with extraordinary emotion. Photographs from the era show smiling faces, excited crowds, handwritten signs, and long lines stretching outside venues hours before performances. Newspapers frequently described audiences whose excitement overwhelmed ordinary concert etiquette. It was not merely appreciation, it was enthusiasm expressed with complete sincerity. For many young people, Elvis represented something difficult to define. He respected earlier musical traditions while sounding entirely modern. He appeared confident without seeming distant. His performances carried energy that felt spontaneous, rather than carefully manufactured. The world seemed to be changing alongside him, and perhaps that is why audiences recognize something of themselves in his music. Cultural moments often arrive quietly before anyone gives them a name. Only later do historians identify turning points. Those living through them simply experience ordinary days that somehow feel different from the ones before. During these months, Elvis also began working with musicians whose professionalism helped shape the recordings that would define an era. Studio sessions demanded patience rather than excitement. While audiences imagined dramatic moments of inspiration, much of recording involved repetition. A verse sung again, a guitar part adjusted slightly, another take, then another. The finished record often concealed the quiet discipline required to create it. Recording studios remained places where time behaved differently. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Coffee cups accumulated near mixing desks. Musicians alternated between conversation and complete concentration. Outside, the city continued its routines. Inside, people searched patiently for performances that felt effortless. Ironically, the most natural recordings often required remarkable care. As one success followed another, invitations arrived from every direction: concerts, television, interviews, photographs, promotional appearances. Each opportunity seemed valuable. Each demanded time. Each occupied another portion of the calendar. Days became carefully arranged long before they were lived. One can almost imagine an assistant placing another appointment into an already crowded schedule. Another city, another flight, another performance. The spaces between obligations quietly shrink. Yet somewhere amid this growing whirlwind remained the young man who had once listened carefully inside Mississippi churches and practiced guitar in modest rooms. Fame changes surroundings more quickly than it changes the heart. The inner life often moves at its own patient pace. Returning to Graceland whenever possible offered something increasingly rare. The mansion had become more than an impressive residence. It was one of the few places where familiar routines could still survive. Friends gathered without tickets. Family conversations continued without reporters. Favourite rooms remained exactly where memory expected them to be. Home possesses remarkable healing qualities for those whose lives require constant travel. Even silence sounds different there. A familiar hallway, the scent of polished wood, the comforting rhythm of doors opening and closing exactly as they always have. Outside the gates, admirers often waited. Inside, life attempted to remain wonderfully ordinary. Meals were shared, music drifted casually through rooms. Late-night conversations wandered from serious topics into laughter and back again. For a little while, celebrity loosened its grip. Not entirely, but enough to breathe. It is easy to imagine that fame removes loneliness forever, because it surrounds a person with people. In reality, crowds and companionship are not the same thing. Thousands may cheer your arrival while only a handful truly know how your ordinary voice sounds during a quiet evening at home. Perhaps this is why familiar friendships become increasingly valuable as public recognition expands. They remember life before headlines, they ask ordinary questions, they allow ordinary silence. Those gifts grow rarer with every passing year. As 1956 continued, Elvis's image became inseparable from American popular culture. His hairstyle was copied. His clothing inspired fashion. Young musicians studied his recordings. Children imitated his movements in front of bedroom mirrors. Without intending to, he had become more than a singer. He had become a symbol. Symbols, however, carry unusual burdens. People project hopes onto them. Expectations multiply. Every appearance acquires meaning beyond itself. A simple smile becomes news. A casual remark becomes a headline. Ordinary human moments slowly disappear beneath extraordinary public attention. Yet each evening still ended the same way. The stage lights dimmed. The audience departed. Workers folded chairs and packed equipment. The last conversations echoed briefly through empty venues before fading into silence. Then came the drive back, perhaps through quiet streets, perhaps beneath a sky filled with stars. The excitement remained behind in the theatre, while the night welcomed another traveller moving toward tomorrow's destination. It is during such drives that applause finally grows distant enough for thoughts to return. No cheering, no interviews, only the gentle sound of tyres meeting the road. Those quiet miles may have been among the few moments when success stopped asking questions and simply allowed the night to unfold. The world believed it knew Elvis Presley. Millions had heard his voice. Millions had watched him perform. Millions had formed impressions through records, television screens, and newspaper photographs. Yet beyond those images existed another life measured not by chart positions or ticket sales, but by late-night conversations, familiar rooms, favourite songs played without an audience, and the rare comfort of being somewhere no performance was required. As another night settles gently over this story, the applause has not disappeared. It has merely drifted into the distance. Somewhere beyond the quiet highways another theatre waits, another audience is gathering, another curtain will soon rise. But for this brief moment, before tomorrow begins asking for more, the silence beside the road feels almost as meaningful as the music itself. There is a particular kind of quiet that exists only after a performance. It arrives gradually rather than all at once. First, the final note fades into the air. Then the applause continues for a few lingering moments, warm and generous, refusing to disappear immediately. Stage lights remain bright while performers bow one last time. Curtains begin to close. Musicians exchange tired smiles. Crew members step carefully onto the stage, already beginning the work that audiences rarely notice. Then, little by little, the building exhales. Seats empty. Conversations drift toward parking lots. Doors close. The echo of thousands of voices slowly becomes the echo of only a handful. By the late 1950s, Elvis Presley had experienced this transformation countless times. Night after night he stepped before audiences whose excitement seemed almost impossible to contain. Yet every evening ended in exactly the same direction, not with louder applause but with quieter hallways. However extraordinary the performance, silence always waited patiently at the end. Imagine walking backstage after one of those concerts. The air still carries the warmth of stage lights. A microphone rests where it was placed only moments earlier. Guitars return to their cases. Someone rolls heavy equipment across the wooden floor. A discarded set list lies unnoticed near the edge of the stage. The room feels strangely peaceful now that its purpose has been fulfilled. There is beauty in places immediately after they have been alive with energy. They seem to remember what has just happened. Elvis often maintained an unconventional daily rhythm. Friends, family members, and colleagues would later recall that he frequently remained awake long after midnight. Evenings seemed to offer him a kind of freedom unavailable during daylight hours. While most of the city slept, expectations softened. Telephone calls became less frequent. Public demands grew quieter. The night belonged to fewer people. Perhaps that made it easier to hear one's own thoughts. Late-night routines developed naturally. Sometimes there were conversations with close friends gathered around Graceland. Sometimes music continued long after formal rehearsals had ended. Sometimes television remained on simply because there was comfort in familiar voices filling otherwise quiet rooms. Ordinary habits became anchors inside an increasingly extraordinary life. Imagine entering the living room during one of those peaceful hours. The lamps are low. Outside, Memphis rests beneath a sky scattered with stars. Inside, a handful of trusted friends sit comfortably without needing constant conversation. Someone pours another cup of coffee. Another quietly changes the record on a turntable. No one seems in a hurry. There is no audience, no performance, only companionship that asks nothing except presence. These moments rarely become part of public history because they produce no headlines. Yet perhaps they reveal more about a person's life than many celebrated achievements. How someone spends quiet evenings often says as much as how they perform before thousands. Music remained present even when work had ended. Those who knew Elvis frequently described informal singing sessions that unfolded without preparation or obligation. Gospel songs often found their way into these gatherings, returning him to the musical traditions that had shaped his earliest years. Familiar harmonies carried memories older than fame itself. One can almost hear the atmosphere. Not polished studio perfection, not carefully arranged concerts, just voices sharing songs because singing together still felt natural. The room itself became part of the music. Walls reflected gentle echoes. Laughter interrupted verses. Someone forgot a lyric and smiled. Another quietly continued the melody. There is something deeply human about music that exists without expectation. The songs need not become records. No critics will review them. No cameras preserve the moment. Their value lies entirely within the experience of those present. Perhaps that is why informal music often feels surprisingly intimate. For a little while, songs return to their oldest purpose, not performance, but connection. As Elvis's fame continued expanding, travel remained constant. Hotels replaced home more often than anyone might have preferred. Suitcases became familiar companions. Favourite belongings were carefully chosen because they needed to fit inside limited space. The routine repeated itself endlessly. Arrival, performance, departure, another city, another audience, another quiet hotel room waiting beyond midnight. Hotel corridors possess a silence unlike that of private homes. The carpets soften footsteps. Doors remain closed. Occasionally an elevator opens somewhere in the distance before returning once again to stillness. Behind every door, another traveller lives a completely different story. For musicians, these temporary spaces become places where public excitement slowly settles back into ordinary thought. Imagine Elvis sitting near the window of a hotel room after midnight. The curtains are slightly open. City lights shimmer below. Traffic has grown lighter than it was only a few hours earlier. The guitar rests nearby, untouched for the moment. Tomorrow's schedule waits folded neatly on a table. The room offers everything necessary for comfort. Yet it cannot quite replace home. Home is rarely defined by furniture. It is defined by familiarity. This perhaps explains why Graceland remained so important throughout his life. No matter how luxurious a hotel became, it remained temporary. Graceland remembered him. The same driveway, the same staircase, the same favourite rooms, the same trees standing quietly beyond the windows. Returning there meant returning to continuity. In a career built upon constant movement, continuity became a rare gift. Friends often gathered at Graceland during these years. Unlike formal business meetings or public appearances, these evenings unfolded without rigid plans. Someone suggested watching a film. Another proposed listening to new records. Conversations wandered naturally between memories, jokes, and long, comfortable silences that required no explanation. True friendship often reveals itself through silence rather than conversation. When people no longer feel compelled to fill every quiet moment with words, they begin sharing something deeper than the information. They share ease. That ease becomes increasingly valuable in lives surrounded by constant public attention. During these late hours, Elvis sometimes explored new recordings by artists he admired. His curiosity about music never truly disappeared beneath success. Even after becoming one of the world's biggest stars, he continued listening carefully. The role of student quietly survived inside the role of icon. Perhaps genuine artists never entirely stop learning. Every new voice offers another possibility. Every unfamiliar arrangement invites another perspective. Success may change circumstances. Curiosity keeps creativity alive. The recording studio remained another place where nighttime often stretched well beyond ordinary schedules. Sessions sometimes continued into the early morning as musicians searched patiently for performances that felt authentic. Unlike concerts, recording demanded extraordinary attention to detail. A single phrase might be sung several different ways. Tempo adjusted slightly. Harmony reconsidered. One instrument softened while another became more prominent. Listeners hearing the finished record would rarely imagine how much quiet concentration lay beneath its apparent simplicity. Picture the studio around 2 o'clock in the morning. Coffee cups stand beside mixing equipment. Sheet music rests across a piano. Someone quietly rewinds the recording tape. The room falls silent before another take begins. No one wishes to interrupt the fragile concentration settling over everyone present. The red recording light glows softly. Then the music begins again. There is something almost meditative about repeated creative work. Far from feeling monotonous, it gradually removes unnecessary effort until only genuine expression remains. Perhaps this explains why some of Elvis's recordings continue feeling so immediate decades later. Behind them stood countless patient hours invisible to listeners. The finished song carries no sign of fatigue, only feeling. During this period, public expectations also continued growing. Every new recording invited comparison with the previous one. Every concert raised hopes for something even more memorable. Every television appearance became an event discussed across the country. Expectation possesses its own quiet weight. Unlike applause, it does not make much noise, yet it accompanies a person everywhere. Imagine finishing one enormously successful performance while already knowing tomorrow's audience expects something equally unforgettable. Success becomes not a destination, but a standard continually requiring renewal. For many performers, the greatest pressure arrives not before success, but after it. There is comfort in striving toward a dream. There is uncertainty in wondering how long one can continue meeting the world's expectations. Yet those close to Elvis often remembered another side that audiences rarely witnessed. A generous host. Someone who enjoyed sharing meals. Someone who laughed easily among trusted friends. Someone who appreciated simple pleasures despite extraordinary circumstances. Fame had altered the scale of his life. It had not erased its ordinary foundations. One late evening at Graceland might end with everyone gradually saying goodnight. The conversations have grown softer. Coffee cups sit empty. A final record finishes playing. Guests quietly gather their coats. Outside, the night air feels cool and still. Cars disappear slowly down the long driveway, until only silence remains. The house settles once again. Footsteps echo briefly through familiar hallways. A lamp is switched off. Another remains glowing somewhere deeper inside the mansion. Even large houses become remarkably peaceful when everyone else has gone home. Perhaps those final quiet minutes before sleep carried unusual importance. No audience remained. No interviews waited. No schedule demanded immediate attention. The world for a little while stopped asking for anything. As we move gently through another night in this story, the contrast becomes increasingly clear. The public life of Elvis Presley unfolded beneath brilliant lights, surrounded by extraordinary excitement. His private evenings unfolded beneath softer lamps, among trusted friends, familiar songs, and rooms where silence no longer needed to compete with applause. It is tempting to believe that greatness exists only in moments the world celebrates. Yet perhaps greatness also survives in quieter habits, in listening, in friendship, in returning home whenever possible, in singing simply because the song still brings comfort, even when no one is there to applaud. Outside Graceland, the trees sway gently in the Tennessee night. Inside, another record has finished spinning. The room grows still. Tomorrow will once again bring cameras, crowds, rehearsals, and endless movement. But not yet. For now, only the quiet remains. And within that quiet, the music somehow lingers a little longer than the sound itself ever could. As the years moved forward, fame no longer felt like a destination waiting somewhere ahead. It had become the landscape itself. There were very few places where Elvis Presley could simply arrive unnoticed. Airports became gathering points long before his plane landed. Hotel entrances filled with admirers hoping for a brief glimpse. Television cameras appeared wherever important appearances had been scheduled. Even ordinary drives through familiar streets often attracted attention from people who happened to recognize the passing automobile. The remarkable thing about public recognition is not how loudly it begins, it is how quietly it becomes permanent. One day a familiar face draws a few curious glances. A few years later, that same face belongs to someone millions believe they already know. Imagine opening the curtains in a hotel suite early in the morning. Below, several fans have already gathered despite the early hour. Some carry cameras, others simply wait patiently. Perhaps they are not even certain he will appear. Waiting itself has become enough. From high above, the scene looks peaceful. Small groups talking quietly, occasional laughter, someone pointing toward the entrance. The excitement has not yet begun. It exists only as possibility. This kind of devotion can feel deeply moving. It can also quietly reshape everyday life. Simple decisions become complicated. A walk outside now requires planning. Dinner at a favorite restaurant becomes an event rather than a meal. Spontaneous afternoons slowly disappear beneath necessary arrangements. Freedom is rarely lost all at once. It is exchanged piece by piece. Another bodyguard, another private entrance, another carefully scheduled departure. Eventually, these adjustments begin to feel normal simply because they happen every day. Yet somewhere beneath those routines remained the memory of a young man who once wandered the streets of Tupelo and Memphis without attracting more than a passing glance. Memory has a curious way of preserving earlier versions of ourselves. No matter how much life changes, some inner part continues remembering simpler days. Perhaps on certain quiet evenings, those memories arrived unexpectedly, not with sadness, not even with longing, only with recognition. A childhood street, a church hymn, the sound of rain against a modest roof, things too ordinary to become famous, yet too meaningful ever to disappear. The demands of success extended beyond performances. Business meetings filled portions of the calendar that audiences never saw. Recording contracts required attention. Film schedules overlapped with concert commitments. Travel arrangements changed repeatedly. Photographs needed approval. Interviews filled afternoons already crowded with obligations. From the outside, success often appears glamorous. From the inside, it frequently resembles an endless sequence of responsibilities. Imagine a dressing room between appointments. A neatly pressed suit hangs nearby. Several newspapers lie folded across a table, each carrying another photograph from the previous day. Someone quietly knocks before entering with tomorrow's itinerary. Another city, another appearance, another carefully planned schedule. The room itself remains calm. The calendar does not. Time becomes one of fame's most valuable possessions, not because there is less of it, because so much of it already belongs to someone else. Even moments intended for rest sometimes become opportunities. Visitors arrive, phone calls continue. Ideas require discussion. Plans change. Silence grows increasingly precious, precisely because it cannot be scheduled. This perhaps explains why late-night hours remain so meaningful. After midnight, the machinery surrounding celebrity finally slowed. Offices closed, reporters stopped calling, airports quieted, the world rested. Only then could ordinary conversations unfold without constantly checking the clock. Graceland offered another kind of protection during these years, not protection from admiration. No walls could entirely separate the mansion from public fascination. Rather, it protected familiar rhythms. Breakfast could still feel like breakfast. Friends could still gather without needing invitations printed by publicists. Favourite rooms remained untouched by changing headlines. Home quietly reminded him that identity extends beyond occupation. Every house develops its own personality over time. Graceland was no different. Certain rooms invited conversation. Others encouraged solitude. The music room seemed to gather memories naturally, while the quieter corners of the house offered places where reading, reflection, or simply sitting near a window felt enough. Imagine one of those quieter rooms during the early hours before dawn. A single lamp glows beside an armchair. Outside, the gardens rest beneath pale moonlight. The house has grown completely still. Even large homes can suddenly feel intimate when everyone else has gone to sleep. A favourite book lies open but unread for the moment. The silence itself has become interesting. Not empty. Simply present. It is remarkable how differently silence feels depending upon what has preceded it. Silence after applause carries gratitude. Silence after travel carries relief. Silence at home carries familiarity. Perhaps each teaches something different. During this period, Elvis also experienced increasing pressure to continue evolving as an artist. Audiences loved familiar songs. Record companies hoped for new successes. Critics compared every release to those that came before. Musicians themselves often stand between two competing desires: to remain recognizable, to continue growing. Neither path is simple. Too much repetition risks becoming predictable. Too much change risks leaving audiences behind. Finding balance requires patience rarely visible from the outside. Recording sessions reflected this careful search. Imagine entering the studio once more. The musicians greet one another warmly. Coffee steams gently from paper cups. Someone tunes a guitar while another quietly reviews handwritten notes. Nothing feels hurried despite the importance of the work ahead. Creativity often begins most naturally when people stop trying to force it. A producer suggests another arrangement. The pianist experiments with a different introduction. The drummer listens carefully before offering an idea. Small adjustments accumulate. Eventually the song begins revealing its true shape. Listeners hearing the finished recording may never realize how many quiet conversations helped create it. The final version sounds inevitable. Its creation rarely was. Music continued providing something beyond professional achievement. It remained a place where emotion could exist without needing explanation. Certain gospel songs still carried the warmth of childhood churches. Certain country melodies still echoed long highways travelled years earlier. Certain blues recordings still recalled the neighbourhoods where young curiosity first learned to listen. Success had expanded his world enormously. Music continued connecting him to its beginning. There is comfort in returning to familiar songs. They do not ask us to become younger. They simply remind us of earlier versions of ourselves. As public attention intensified, acts of generosity quietly continued away from cameras. Friends, employees, musicians, and acquaintances would later remember unexpected gifts, thoughtful conversations, and moments of kindness that seldom reached newspaper headlines. These stories rarely announce themselves. They emerge years later through memory. Kindness often leaves the gentlest footprints. It does not demand recognition. It simply becomes part of someone else's story. Imagine an ordinary afternoon at Graceland. A staff member finishes another day's work. A conversation begins unexpectedly. Laughter follows. Someone leaves feeling lighter than when they arrived. No reporters witnessed the exchange. No photographers documented it. History quietly moved forward anyway. Perhaps the truest measure of a life often appears in moments that no audience ever sees. Meanwhile, the public image continued growing larger than life. Magazine covers, television specials, countless photographs. The figure known simply as Elvis became almost mythical. Yet myths possess unusual limitations. They rarely leave room for ordinary humanity. Real people become tired. They enjoy familiar meals, they miss home while travelling, they appreciate quiet evenings after demanding weeks. Legends are expected to remain extraordinary every hour of every day. Human beings cannot. This contrast may have become one of the quiet challenges accompanying enormous fame. The world celebrated the symbol. Trusted friends continued knowing the person. Both identities existed simultaneously. Neither completely replaced the other. Late at night, when Graceland finally settled into silence, such distinctions perhaps mattered less. The newspapers rested unread until morning. The awards reflected only lamplight. The gates stood closed. Inside, another evening unfolded at its own unhurried pace. A record player turns slowly. Its gentle mechanical rhythm almost resembles breathing. One song finishes. The soft crackle between tracks fills the room for a brief moment. Then another melody begins. Outside, wind moves carefully through the trees. Inside, memory and music become almost impossible to separate. Some songs recall stages filled with thousands. Others return the listener to childhood churches. Still others belong only to quiet nights shared with trusted friends. Every melody carries its own landscape. As our own journey continues, the contrast grows ever more delicate. The louder the world became around Elvis Presley, the more meaningful these quieter moments appear. Not because they solved every pressure, not because they erased responsibility, simply because they remained places where applause no longer needed to define the evening. The spotlight would return tomorrow. Another rehearsal would begin. Another audience would gather. Another schedule would unfold with familiar precision. But tonight, inside Graceland, the house rests peacefully. The rooms ask no questions. The walls expect no performance. Only the gentle company of silence remains, settling softly over photographs, instruments, familiar furniture, and memories that seem content simply to exist without explanation. In such moments, fame stands waiting outside the gates. Inside, the night belongs once again to the quiet life that had always existed beneath it. By the beginning of the 1960s, another stage was quietly waiting. It did not have velvet curtains rising before a live audience. There were no thousands of voices filling an arena before the first note. Instead, there were cameras resting on heavy tripods, carefully arranged lights suspended from towering rigs, painted sets built to resemble distant places, and directors studying scenes through thoughtful silence. For Elvis Presley, Hollywood would become a different kind of performance. The journey west did not erase music. It simply asked him to express himself through another medium. Imagine arriving at a film studio just after sunrise. Large sound stages stand like enormous quiet warehouses against the California sky. Workers unlock side entrances. Electricians adjust lighting high above carefully constructed sets. Costume racks stretch along long corridors. Somewhere in the distance, someone softly tests a piano for a scene that has not yet begun. Unlike a concert venue, a movie studio awakens slowly. Its excitement is hidden beneath preparation. Everything appears calm until the cameras begin rolling. The transition from recording artist to film actor did not happen overnight. Elvis had already become one of the most recognizable faces in America. His popularity naturally attracted the attention of film producers, who understood that audiences eager to hear him sing would also gladly watch him on the silver screen. In 1956, he had made his acting debut in Love Me Tender. The title itself borrowed from one of his songs, quietly reminding audiences that music remained inseparable from his identity. Imagine the first morning on that set. Costumes carefully prepared, scripts resting neatly upon tables, actors introducing themselves between rehearsals. There is an unusual silence before filming begins. Everyone knows exactly what must happen. No one speaks louder than necessary. Then comes the familiar call. Action. A moment earlier, the room had been ordinary. Now every gesture carries intention. Every pause matters. Every glance becomes part of a story that audiences will not see for many months. Film work asks for a different kind of patience than live performance. Concerts move forward without interruption. One song follows another until the evening naturally concludes. Films, however, are assembled piece by piece. A single conversation may require several camera angles. One short scene may occupy an entire afternoon. The finished story exists only later, carefully woven together through editing. This rhythm demanded something new. Imagine repeating the same walk across a room, again, and then once more. The director quietly suggests another variation. The lighting shifts slightly. The camera moves only a few feet. Nothing feels hurried. Cinema rewards careful repetition rather than spontaneous momentum. For someone accustomed to the immediate energy of live audiences, such work must have carried its own quiet discipline. Music offered instant connection. Film required trust that emotion would survive months between recording and release. As the years continued, Elvis appeared in a long series of films including Jailhouse Rock, King Creole, Blue Hawaii, Viva Las Vegas, and many others. Each production created its own temporary world, a beach that existed inside a studio, a lively nightclub recreated beneath carefully controlled lighting, a quiet street built entirely for the camera. Actors often speak about the strange beauty of movie sets. From one direction they appear entirely convincing. Step behind the painted walls, however, and another reality appears. Wooden supports, lighting cables, crew members waiting patiently just beyond the edge of the frame. Illusion and craftsmanship exist together without conflict. Perhaps fame itself resembles a film set in certain ways. Audiences see the finished picture. Behind it stands an enormous amount of careful work that remains invisible. Imagine Elvis walking through a studio lot between scenes. The afternoon sun warms the pavement. Nearby, another production films an entirely different story. Costume designers carry garments across the courtyard. Someone wheels a camera toward another soundstage. The atmosphere feels surprisingly ordinary, despite the extraordinary images these buildings eventually create. Between scenes comes waiting. Actors spend remarkable portions of their day simply waiting. Waiting while lights are adjusted. Waiting while cameras are repositioned. Waiting while another performer finishes a close-up. These quiet intervals become part of professional life. Perhaps Elvis understood waiting better than most. Long before fame, he had waited for opportunities. During concerts, he waited behind curtains. Inside recording studios, he waited for the red recording light. Now Hollywood added another rhythm of waiting. Creative lives often contain more patience than excitement. During these years, music never truly disappeared. Many of the films featured songs recorded specifically for their stories. Recording sessions continued alongside filming schedules. The familiar studio microphone remained a constant companion, even as movie cameras occupied increasing portions of the calendar. Imagine leaving a film set at sunset. Costume removed. Script placed carefully inside a leather folder, the day's filming complete. Instead of returning directly home, another studio waits nearby. Musicians are already assembling. Sheet music rests upon piano stands. Another evening of recording quietly begins. The transition feels almost seamless. Actor becomes singer once again. The work changes. The voice remains the same. There is something comforting about returning repeatedly to music. No matter how many new experiences life introduces, familiar melodies continue offering recognizable ground beneath one's feet. Perhaps recording sessions felt increasingly like home, not because the rooms remained identical, because the language of music never required translation. One of the most memorable films from this period, Blue Hawaii, carried audiences into bright tropical landscapes filled with sunshine, beaches, and gentle songs. Imagine the contrast. Outside the theatre, winter winds sweep across northern cities. Inside the cinema, palm trees sway softly beneath clear skies. For 2 hours, audiences travel somewhere warmer without leaving their seats. Cinema possesses that remarkable ability. It borrows places, it preserves moments, it quietly offers escape. For millions of viewers, these films became companions during ordinary weekends. Families gathered together, children laughed at familiar scenes. Favourite songs lingered long after the closing credits disappeared. The movies became part of everyday life. Yet creating such effortless entertainment required countless careful hours behind the scenes. Early call times, long rehearsals, repeated takes, patient collaboration among hundreds of people whose names audiences would never know. Every finished film quietly honoured the invisible craftsmanship. As the decade progressed, however, musical tastes began changing. New artists emerged. Fresh sounds reached radio stations. Popular culture continued evolving exactly as it always does. No era remains still for very long. For established performers, such changes invite thoughtful reflection. How does one continue growing while remaining authentic? How does one honour earlier successes without becoming trapped inside them? These questions rarely receive immediate answers. Instead, they unfold gradually across years. Imagine Elvis sitting quietly inside a dressing room after filming has ended. The costume hangs nearby. Outside the door, crew members are already preparing tomorrow's scenes. The room itself has become peaceful. A small radio plays softly in the background. New songs by younger artists drift gently through the speaker. He listens, not critically, simply attentively. The curious listener from Memphis has never entirely disappeared. Artists who continue listening rarely stop learning. Hollywood also introduced friendships with actors, directors, musicians, and countless creative professionals whose lives revolved around storytelling rather than touring. Conversations naturally expanded. Music remained central, yet discussions now wandered towards scripts, cinematography, editing, and the remarkable process of transforming imagination into moving images. Every creative field teaches another way of seeing. Perhaps these years quietly broadened his understanding of performance itself. Not everything needed to be expressed through song alone. Sometimes silence between spoken lines carried equal weight. Sometimes a simple glance revealed more than dialogue. Sometimes the camera noticed details impossible for a distant concert audience to see. Performance became more intimate. The lens observed carefully. It rewarded restraint as much as energy. Back at Graceland, however, the rhythm remained comfortingly familiar whenever filming schedules allowed. Returning home after weeks or months away carried its own quiet satisfaction. The driveway appeared exactly as remembered. The front door opened onto familiar rooms. Friends greeted him without rehearsed introductions. The piano waited patiently. Home asks no one to prove themselves. It simply welcomes their return. As another Hollywood evening fades gently into night, the vast studio lots grow quieter. The cameras are covered. The lights cool slowly overhead. Painted streets stand empty until tomorrow's scenes begin. Somewhere nearby, a soundtrack is still being recorded. Elsewhere, an editor carefully assembles fragments of film into a complete story. Creative work never truly sleeps. It simply changes rooms. For Elvis Presley, these years represented another chapter rather than a departure. The stage had become larger, the audience broader, the methods different. Yet beneath the costumes, scripts, cameras, and carefully constructed worlds remained the same thoughtful musician who had once listened closely to gospel harmonies in Mississippi churches and wandered Memphis streets collecting songs almost without realizing it. Tomorrow, another scene will be filmed. Another song will be recorded. Another audience will watch from somewhere far away. But tonight the studio has fallen silent. The painted sets wait patiently beneath dimmed lights. And somewhere beyond Hollywood, beneath the quiet Tennessee sky, Graceland continues waiting too, its familiar rooms holding space for the moments when performance finally gives way to home.